Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
After many weeks of demonstrations everywhere in Hong Kong, it seems that the effective seizure of Hong Kong Airport, one of the world's busiest, has proved to be the final straw for China, and most expect a distinct hardening of the line that China will take towards the mass disruption and economic loss caused by the demonstrators.
The British government, which seized the territory 150 years ago to punish China for stopping the British opium trade, has called for calm. The American government has, however, been turning up the heat. A suspiciously large number of US flags have appeared in the hands of the demonstrators, and the Stars and Stripes appears to be their anthem.
Joining us to discuss what's going on in Hong Kong and what might happen next is one of Britain's leading communists, a long-standing friend of China, Dr. Ranjit Brar. Doctor, welcome to the show. Let's start with what the demands of these protesters actually are, because it's obviously quite difficult to negotiate a change in Hong Kong's entire status within the country. Are there any of the protesters' demands that China could accept?
George, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be with you both, George and Gayatri. And I think it's a very interesting question. So the protesters do have some demands, which are long-standing. They have a particular cultural identity. You know, they will speak Cantonese, for example, rather than the mainland Putonghua, the common tongue, or Mandarin. And increasingly, since there's been the union, once again, of Hong Kong with China, there's been a large number of people who come and speaking the mainland language. And so there are some elements of their own regional and national identity which they're very proud of and wish to preserve. That's not unique to the people of Hong Kong. There are 18 million people who speak that language group, and the vast majority of them are within Guangzhou, within the wider area surrounding Hong Kong and part of China. So that in itself is not really a demand which would lead to major protests. There are elements around housing, which is very expensive. There are elements around schooling, which is in short supply. There are elements around medical care, normal social demands, what interestingly Mao would have characterized as contradictions among the people, things which can be raised as legitimate grievances and are in every society, and can also be sorted out within the context and framework of that society. What's very clear to me is when you look at it, it bears all the hallmarks, not of just a domestic dispute, and our mainstream media are very keen to present it just as a purely domestic affair, but it's far more intermingled with the longer-term history of Hong Kong. And the history of Hong Kong, I have to say, is one which mirrors the history of British imperialism. It's a history which mirrors intervention of Britain within India, within China, and the very founding of those huge financial institutions that make Hong Kong such a major global city.
The flags has become quite a totemic issue. When the protesters broke into the Assembly building, the local parliament, they hoisted the British colonial flag. That's been kind of superseded. Perhaps the Americans didn't like that quite so much, because out of nowhere there seemed to have been a very large number of American flags appearing. This seems to suggest what China called the black hand of American interference in the territories. Is that how you see it?
I think that's a very succinct and apt summary, George. It has all the hallmarks of what we've come to be so familiar with as really the beginnings of a colour revolution. If you look at the beginning of the dispute in Syria, it's straying from the point, but I think it bears some comparison. So in 2011, there seemed to be genuine social discontent around certain issues, and large demonstrations and the government trying to address that. And within that, there was a radical group who were not content. No concession that can be granted by the government would satisfy them. Rather, they used every grievance and every dispute as grounds for furthering the dispute, of widening the anger, of deepening the protest and escalating. There's a theory circulating amongst the demonstrators within Hong Kong where they talk about a marginal violence. So what they want a core group of protesters to do is to be very provocative. And they have actually engaged in acid attacks upon the police, in taking their weapons and beating them, in surrounding and coming very close to lynching policemen. None of that is shown in our social media, but you can see it if you look for it on YouTube. It's very clearly happened. And then in response and in acts of self-defense, one doesn't associate an act of self-defense with the state. There's an automatic assumption that if a policeman pulls a weapon, he's the aggressor. And that comes from our own experience in the United States, in Britain, in most countries where workers are very much oppressed by the state. That's actually not the case in Hong Kong and China. But what is very clear is they provoke the police into acts of self-defense and then picture, very widely, as they did in Venezuela, alleged acts of state repression. And so they're trying to build up, which is not a new thing, a very clear propagandistic image as a heavy repressive state crushing democracy. And that's a point that I think we can come back to, because there's a genuine misconception propagated by our own media that Hong Kong has a long history of democracy prior to its being granted, or rather reunified with China. And that's absolutely not the case.
That's a very good point, because everything that is in the mainstream media is ahistorical. Gayatri's point there that we actually only ever had Hong Kong in our possession to punish China for refusing to allow us to sell drugs in their country.
Which is amazing if you think about it.
Yeah,
it's so ridiculous.
Well, even in the history of imperialism,
exactly.
That's quite a sordid affair. But there was no democracy in Hong Kong throughout that 150 years.
Absolutely. And I think there are a couple of points that I'll briefly make that illustrate that very starkly. One is, you'll be familiar probably, George, with the rubber bullet, which was so notoriously used in the north of Ireland, one of Britain's oldest colony, to repress particularly the Republican community. But a rubber bullet is a dangerous thing. It's fired with a high explosive round, and there's been many deaths associated with it. But the rubber bullet we associate with that conflict in the north of Ireland that I grew up with in the 70s, 80s, perhaps into the early 90s. The rubber bullet was invented and first deployed in Hong Kong against rioting Chinese. The Chinese lived as colonial slaves. They were literally cage cities where the workers would live. They were so poor and housing was so expensive. They would sleep within a cage, so open air, cages one on top of another in entire areas of the city. So this is the economic poverty, the relative economic enslavement of the local population, who had not a word to say about the appointment of the governor and the ruling power.
We fired rubber bullets first.
Absolutely.
In Hong Kong when we ruled it.
That is true. That is an absolute fact. And you can,
every day is a school day. Now, what's going to happen next? I happen to think, I think the record shows it, that actually the Chinese authorities have been quite patient with these demonstrators. If Heathrow was occupied by thousands of demonstrators for days and even weeks, bringing all flights to a halt, I can promise you Heathrow would be cleared of those demonstrators. And I think that's true everywhere in the world. But that is only now beginning to happen in Hong Kong. At the same time, people's fear is that China will crack down on this with a heavy hand and really serious, widespread violence and casualties will be the result. Do you think there's a danger of that?
There are dangers both ways, and that's the beauty of these destabilization scenarios. If you don't do anything to check an act of mass destabilization, which ultimately doesn't have defined goals because its goal is to get as much as it can. So if they can push and push and push, they wanted in Tiananmen Square a kind of a Yeltsin moment. They wanted to have a full counter-revolution and turn over this huge area of China with all its national resources, it's huge prize. India was the jewel in the crown of British imperialism, but modern business looks to China as a source of investment, as a source of cheap labor, as a place to make profit. And if they can not only just gain marketization, but full control economically and politically, there's huge amount of money to be made. So that's their ultimate game. They didn't get that. And now they're looking more towards a kind of Maidan moment, I think, a campaign of destabilization and to see what they can get. Of course, people argue about what China is. It's a very common topic of debate. Is it socialist? Is it communist? Is it fat capitalist? Economically, there are huge elements of capitalism within China. There are more billionaires in China than any other country apart from the United States, and that's a apparent contradiction. And that means that within Chinese society, there are some elements who would be open to that kind of movement. But I can tell you that the vast masses of Chinese people, are thankful for the revolution that liberated them from 150 years of colonial humiliation and took hundreds of millions, 500 million people lifted out of poverty. It's widely put about communism equals mass carnage, devastation, destruction and death is the kind of dogma that we're asked to accept and was repeated so often that we kind of do accept it very often unfailingly. If you actually look behind those statistics, when Mao came to power, when he famously stood, and we're coming up to the 70th anniversary on the 1st of October this year of the revolution, when actually the Chinese finally achieved liberation and kicked colonial elements out and kicked the comprador elements who actually represented the United States in the Chiang Kai-shek government and still occupy Taiwan, of course. And he said Chinese people have stood up. The Chinese people at that point had a life expectancy of 35 years, average life expectancy. Yet we're told millions died under Mao, and we can talk about the ins and outs perhaps on another occasion of the vicissitudes of a long revolutionary struggle for liberation. But when Mao died, the average life expectancy of the Chinese people had doubled. It was 70 years, and the population of China had doubled. And that is really a statistic which speaks volumes about what the Chinese people won from their revolution. And overall, they're extremely keen to protect it, and certainly to protect their independence and national sovereignty. And that's really what's at stake at the heart of this issue.
Dr. Ranjit, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Coming up next, it's the first part of a special on Irish politics. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Claire Daly is the most exciting political figure to come out of Ireland in the best part of 100 years. That's my honest opinion. Several times elected as an independent member of the Irish Parliament, the Dáil, she's just gone and got herself elected as an independent member of the European Parliament. They won't know what hit them. Earlier this week, Claire Daly was in London, and I caught up with her to ask her what her background was, how she got started in politics.
Well, I came from, I suppose, a non-traditional background. My father was an army officer. I suppose politics was introduced to me in college. It was the time of the 1980s, education cuts. Nobody in Ireland who went to college could get a job at that time. So there was a lot of movement around that. There was a divorce referendum. The Labour Party at the time campaigned in that, and I joined the Labour Party. So through that and student union activism, I suppose, I was introduced to left-wing groups.
And how did that go down in an army officer's household?
Not too good to start with, to be perfectly honest. It took a long, long time to get over that. It was, my family would have been very conservative politically, didn't like it. Their view would have been politics is something you keep to yourself. You don't let anybody else know, you don't really get involved. So that was actually difficult. It was only when I suppose I became more respectable in the sense of it being involved in electoral politics that they began to understand it a bit more. I suppose to them, activism and that didn't seem like real politics. And then when I got involved in electoral politics, it seemed more normal, I suppose.
Now, you were one of many independent political operators, independent of the big political parties which dominated the Irish Republic from the inception, the two Civil War parties, and then a Labour Party that began to be represented in politics. But you were always to the left of them, and latterly as an independent. Now, for many people in Britain, this is quite, I speak as someone who's twice been elected to Parliament as an independent, and therefore I know how hard it is. But what is it about Ireland that they seem to plump for people of independent mind and increasingly, you could say, disdain the traditional parties of the state?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I suppose the short answer is, first, single transferable vote, PR. But there's obviously a lot more than that. I mean, there's PR in Malta, for example, and they've no independents elected. Whereas if you look back in Ireland, I think well over almost 150 independents have got elected to the Irish Parliament. Now, I suppose the first thing is that they're very different. So you could have your sort of local, maybe community campaign type independent. You'd have sort of some solidly anti-establishment independents as well. I think in the history of the last period, since 1980, there were, I think, 11 different governments, and 7 of them relied on independence for support. So I suppose independents have been influential as well in Ireland. Why is it like that? I suppose it must be in some ways because our system allows independents to stand in, that there are no barriers. You don't need a big wad of money. You don't need, anything, a lot of names to go on a ballot paper. You can just stand yourself. Which makes it easy. Now, I know in Britain, for example, probably a lot of people would stand, but they haven't a hope in hell of getting elected as an independent, and that's the difference. So I suppose it's because we had those 2 Civil War parties that were there. People rejected that and wanted something different, and I suppose strong individuals were able to come through and wield power.
Tell me about those parties, because most British people, of course, don't remember the Civil War, what the origin of the division was. And for the most part, it would look like to me that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are really 2 cheeks of the same backside. They hate each other with a vengeance that has lasted 100 years. But in fact, you couldn't slip sixpence between them, could you?
Not a bit of it. And to most Irish people now, that difference is becoming blurred now, which is a good thing, because in the last couple of elections, for the first time, they got less than 50% of the vote between them. Now, the problem was, I suppose, the rest of the opposition was quite split. But you're totally right. These are 2 right-wing bourgeois parties with practically the same ideology. Traditionally, I suppose, Fine Gael were the party of the big farmers, and Fianna Fáil might have thrown a few crumbs at the working class a bit more, maybe looked after the small farmers, but in the Celtic Tiger, and that very much morphed with the builders, the developers, and they were all responsible for the fact that Irish industry never really developed properly. So it was I suppose, the ruling class had a great luxury, didn't they? They 2 sides of the same coin. Heads you win, tails they win again, you know what I mean? So they had the luxury of having 2 parties that were basically the same. And we see it now, whereby Fine Gael are being propped up by Fianna Fáil. We've a minority Fine Gael government at the moment, but they are only in power because Fianna Fáil have agreed to keep them there. They call it a confidence and supply arrangement.
James Connolly famously said that if you only change the flag on Dublin Castle and don't change everything else, then independence will be scarcely worth having fought for. And in a way, that's been the history of the last 100 years, hasn't it? Because
Totally.
all they did was run a green flag up over Dublin Castle, took the Union-hated Union Jack down, but nothing else really changed.
Well, if you think about it, they kind of traded British imperialism for bowing down in front of what, US imperialism, really. And a lot of what goes on is sort of pandering and just running after foreign direct investment, giving over Shannon Airport to the US military to use, no criticism whatsoever. Just, we'll do anything for jobs. I think we see that in terms of Apple even and the money, the big tax revenue.
That was a fascinating
unbelievable
thing. So the European Union were demanding that Apple pay billions of euros to Ireland, and Ireland was saying, no, we don't want it.
And that's still ongoing. I mean, 13 billion euros in the context of Ireland, like that's a huge amount of money. It's greater than our education budget. So, and Europe says, no, Apple has to pay this to the Irish Exchequer. The Irish government says, and is saying, we don't want it. Actually, we'll take a case against the European Union to give that money back. Now, my God, talk about prostituting your country. That's pretty bad. And that's exactly what and we see that, and that's really been the sort of record of the ruling class in Ireland, and that's why we have an enormous housing problem. We've a lot of people being left behind. So the illusion is we're this great emerging modern state now. We've got all liberal on divorce and same-sex marriage and abortion and all the rest, that we're catching up with modern times. No such thing. No such thing. We're still, that servile attitude of sort of being dominated by other powers is still there. In the minds of the ruling classes, obviously ordinary people view it quite differently.
There have been some massive changes in my life. I come from an Irish Catholic background myself, and since my childhood I've been travelling to Ireland. So the first time I went there, the church was king. It's not king now, is it?
No, and it is an incredible difference for people maybe who've been away a while. Even like when I was growing up, it was very dominant. I suppose maybe the last 10 years, even 5 years, in terms of social progress and actual changes has been immense. The church, of course, lost its base primarily because of the child abuse and the sex abuse scandals. We have still now the horrible stories of the misnamed mother and baby homes, the incarceration of women who were pregnant outside of marriage, appalling crimes committed on people in the name of religion. So the church's influence has waned for quite a long time now, and while there would be some people amongst the older generations who would still go to Mass, and actually a huge amount of people who would still call themselves Catholic, but like they wouldn't say any prayers or anything. It's the pomp and the ceremony. It's the marking of an occasion rather than any influence over their hearts and minds. Those days are long gone, and the fact that the church tried to put in such a campaign in the recent abortion referendum to keep Ireland's restrictive laws on abortion, and were absolutely trounced across the board. Every part of the country, every age group, every social class rejected out of hand, and there'll be no coming back from that situation.
It was the most Catholic country in Europe. And now it isn't. Do you think the church can ever make a comeback in Ireland?
I don't. I just can't see it, you know. That authority is gone, and it wasn't on its own. I mean, the political establishment has lost a lot of authority. Obviously, the banking sector and all of that have lost a lot of authority. So that's probably one of the reasons why we've had, large numbers of what we call left-wing independents or small political parties getting elected. That's why we had the election before last, the two historic parties going below 50% for the first time, and it's reflection of the fact that all of the institutions, I suppose, of state power, their authority is gone. I mean, we've had the Garda Síochána. I'm proud to say that I was involved in getting rid of 2 Garda commissioners and 2 Minister for Justice over scandals in the Irish police force. So all of the great institutions. Exactly.
That's, of course, mirrored here. Of course, we are 2 countries divided by a common language, and our history is very different. But the tale you tell of collapsing institutions and their credibility is common here. The national question was, of course, was the original division between the Civil War parties, as we've described them. Fianna Fáil was the more nationalist of the 2. But my experience is, whilst the reunification of Ireland is the major issue in the north of Ireland, it's not nearly such a big an issue in the Republic. Is that your take?
I'd say it's hardly an issue at all. It really is a very low on the horizon. Actually, ironically, Brexit has been a huge spur in the idea of United Ireland, because ironically, prior to that, people in the south, particularly if they weren't near the border, didn't really care all that much. They might go up for a bit of shopping, whichever way the currency was going. They would go and do their Christmas shopping and all the rest, but that was about the height of it. But now, against the backdrop of Brexit and the possibility of a hard border or any border re-emerging, for everybody on the island, the ludicrousness of a partitioned island of that tiny size is emerging, and we see it even amongst some elements of the Protestant community and so on. So yeah, I actually think it's moved in that direction a bit more, that people would talk about it a bit more favourably than maybe previously, because nobody wants the border to be back.
The Irish MEP Claire Daly. Next week we find out what she really thinks of the EU. Don't miss it. But now it's time to find out what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Right, so we asked what is really going on in Hong Kong. And Fra Hughes, our friend, says it's Maidan Square Mark II.
This is the Ukraine analogy, yeah.
There you go. And Anti-B says the evil seeds that the British left in China is still causing pain and trouble for the Chinese. They looted, plunged their natural resources and destroyed many generations by making the people addicted to opium. Their presence was so evil that it's still causing pain. Hashtag Hong Kong.
I do think it's a great pity more British people don't know how we came to have Hong Kong in our possession in the first place. If they did, they might be a bit embarrassed.
No, that's all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on our social media, on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.